Gate presentation today. So let's start off with a big problem. So climate history as a field it has a couple key problems. First of all, it's messy, right? We have lots of marginalized communities, some more represented than others. We have interpersonal relationships. We have interpreting historical and climate data and who interprets the data. And we have limitations on historical archives, basically what's recorded and what's not over the years. Uh, this, but these lead to difficulty having clear and concise connections between them. Some of the approaches that we've gone over in class were racial capitalism, colonial impacts on marginalized communities, and the idea of the Anthropocene. All of these ideas blend together race, power, and inequality. So connecting these to Baker's work, first one is racial capitalism. So, because marginalized groups have been disproportionately exposed and to changes in climate, Baker can see this and say that these people were exploited for their service in industrialized nations due to a power imbalance. Next, we have the idea of the Anthropocene, and this is critical for Baker, as it proves for the backbone of the idea that climate change is not just a scientific issue, but rather it's a global issue that is caused and rooted in colonial practices and relies on global inequalities. Finally, we have Carey and the radicalized impact of climate events. So Baker draws attention to this when highlighting race, power, and climate science effects on shaping global warming policies, where colonialism still plays a big role in these power dynamics. So next we have the detailed study of my paper. So chapter 7, Future Struggles, is set in the late 20th century to 21st century. It focuses on the rise of climate change as a global security issue. Uh, he not acknowledges the increase of recognition of climate change as a significant threat and frames climate change to politics, science, and security circles. So the historical problem is that Baker highlights is the politicization of climate change and the issues surrounding climate security, as it's often discussed in apolitical terms, but framed as a technological problem that requires experts to intervene. This causes climate security experts and institutions to manage the climate futures without directly interacting with political causes of climate change that lurk under the surface. As an introduction to climate security, Baker begins by contextualizing the emergence of climate change as a security threat. And he proposes that institutions can propose potential risks. Uh, Expertise in their technocratic turn uh, basically says that climate change needs to be solved and climate change cannot be talked out of, basically through politics. But this shows the consequences of this, where uh, removing climate change from policies, key stakeholders in those institutions can avoid the root cause of climate change. This allows for governments to maintain their status quo without compromising. So some of the essential actors that we have here are climate security experts, such as scientists. We have government bodies and international institutions, such as militaries, the UN, or other global or institutions. And we have corporations and fossil fuel interests, such as big companies like Shell or other gas companies. But mainly, the relationship between these actors is mainly cooperative and has a little bit of tension. All of them want to work together in order to not die, right, with climate change, but they still want to maintain their status quo without having to make compromise in order to continue making money. Okay. So expanding the horizon, so changing the dynamics across the period. So in the earlier stages, people tried to frame climate as a tech problem in order to save the status quo. But over time, increasing visibility of climate change, as in droughts or in other natural disasters, causes institutions to act. Then after this, anti-technological activists attack the root of the problem, i.e., politicians and political issues. And this causes an overall shift in conflict dynamics, where experts want to maintain the status quo, but need to appeal to the new resistance of individual politicians and the public. So the first reading we have is Paul Edwards. So his is framed roughly the same time period as my main reading as Baker. Uh, but instead he focuses on climate data, models, and technologies, with their different interpretations based on who's reading it and how they're reading it. His argument is that climate models are influenced by social, political, and scientific contexts, and this is called the pragmatic approach. But one idea that I really like is that he uses a signal and noise metaphor for this idea, where you have clear and concise data, i.e., the signal, which is confused and often muted by the noise, which is by like often confusing data or over exaggerated data. Next, we have Ramirez, and they wrote their paper about, or in 2009, about the ClimateGate scandal. Basically, this was when a bunch of emails were leaked and questioned scientific integrity because they often over exaggerated certain data points. So her main argument is that scientists want to use a boundary work theory where they want to maintain their status as a reputable scientist and stay away from debate. They do this often by depolarizing their papers and trying to stay away from politics at all costs. But in doing so, they often make their papers inherently political and causes debate in the process. So Ramirez focuses on scientific authority, where political controversy and public perception of climate science causes political adds a political dimension to this, where authority can be challenged by the average person, and political and public discourse is often challenged by normal people. Uh, she argues that boundary work and the politics of scientific authority is a useful tool for defending scientists' work, but their valiant efforts for depoliticizing their work often leads to politicizing it. So expanding both of their arguments, Edwards says that uh, all data or most of scientific data is limited, bias, and needs context. So adding them together, we have political controversy plus biased data should equal systematic change, not technological, where technological change would have no controversy and unbiased data. Together, these readings help us understand that the depolarization of climate change is not just an intellectual or technological issue, but deeply contested in the political process with significant implications for governments and policy. Okay, so for the meta argument of my assignment is this. How does the case of ClimateGate illustrate the larger problem that Baker is trying to describe about depolarization of the climate future, and how does the politics of climate science described by Edwards and Ramirez require us to expand the terrain of depolarization in the eternal politics of climate science? Okay. So I picked three quotes or four quotes. The first one is by Zeke Baker, chapter 7, page 226 to 227. It says that some think tank organizations and experts have lacked elite military credibility and instead focus on how to shape climate science to better align with the security establishment. So this quote helps establish that think tank organizations are independent and often lack elite military credibility. It's kind of like the scientists before. And instead of focusing on climate science, they want to align with their security establishment in order to maintain funding or just maintain protection. These second two are by Paul Edwards, and both of them boil down to the scientific consensus, where both scientists agree that people cause climate change, and people cause change in the environment. The debate isn't that it's happening, it's how often and in what amount. And so I think it's really interesting how in the second quote, uh, he kind of jabs at the credible scientific positions of these people, kind of saying that no good scientist worth their salt would disagree with him. This last quote I picked was on page 400 to 401 by Ramirez. And so it says that is, if you scientists believe that members of the public trusted climate scientists unconditionally before ClimateGate occurred, following the release of stolen emails, according to the scientists' reasoning, Open a transparent scientist that would be or science that would be necessary to resolve the problem of public mistrust to achieve social consensus with the regard to global warming. So this brings into the idea the idea of public trust before and after ClimateGate, where before science was kind of trusted full-heartedly, i.e. the phrase like trust the science. And now after ClimateGate, a lot more things are skeptical. Uh, one of the things that isn't concept or skeptical is that the only consensus is that there is no consensus, where that a lot of people agree with disagreeing, but a lot of people like to agree on everything. I like this call to more transparency in science, but it's after the emails were exposed. Uh, because this still doesn't acknowledge the change in the systemic system. That's ultimately the root cause of this. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for watching.